Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to return to the summer of 2007, often referred to as Troop Dupe format, and take a look at one of the first times in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that elemental heroes were considered both playable and competitive. Today we're going to be taking a look at a version of Jeff Jones' Big City deck, a deck that revolved around the power of course, elemental hero Stratos, arguably the most powerful elemental hero of all time, but also the newly released Elemental Hero Ocean and previous Elemental Hero cards like Our Righteous Justice, Skyscraper 2, Elemental Hero Wild Heart, and of course Emergency Call. This is a deck that's not going to contain a lot of the Elemental Hero staples that we would see in the following years. There's no Alias in this deck, there's no Gemini Spark, there's no Miracle Fusion, none of the Elemental Hero Fusions will make a feature in this deck, there's no Hero Blast, none of that. This is a deck that revolves around trying to generate as much card advantage as possible with Elemental Hero Ocean, protecting it through the use of your trap cards until your standby phase, so you can recur elemental heroes either from the graveyard most ideally, but even sometimes bouncing them from the field like Stratos, and then using Skyscraper 2 to continually recur elemental heroes that have been destroyed by battle, making it so that over a prolonged period of time, you can grind your opponent out through a resource battle where your deck is especially geared with cards like Trap Dust Shoot and even cards like Gravity Bind, Triple Solemn Judgment, to really pinpoint exactly what your opponent has going on and grind them out through your card advantage engines. This deck went toe-to-toe, at least early on, with versions of Troop Dupe, whether that's T-Hero, the Machine Beatdown deck, or some of the later incarnations. Unfortunately for Elemental Hero fans, Jeff Jones was one of the only players that really saw success during Troop Dupe with this format, but it certainly set the stage for the direction of Elemental Hero decks in the future. A deck with a relatively small monster count, somewhere around 10 to 15, a really robust trap lineup. Obviously, the later versions of Elemental Heroes, like the one that I used at Long Beach, sort of had that same general focus. Grind your opponent out, small Elemental Hero package, big trap lineup. So in many ways, we can credit Jeff Jones' version of Elemental Heroes from 2007 to at least get the ball rolling into the direction that later Elemental Hero decks would take. But without further ado, let's take a deep dive look at Jeff Jones' Big City deck, specifically from the YCS in Philadelphia. All right, we'll start with the monster lineup. We have 3 copies of Elemental Hero Ocean, 3 copies of Elemental Hero Wild Heart. Then we have a Stratos limited to 1 to go along with our 6 Elemental Heroes. Then we have 2 Snipe Hunters and a Morphing Jar. So a really small monster lineup. First, let's talk about Ocean. So Ocean is one of the Elemental Heroes that has not really seen a ton of play over the years, or even back 15 years ago when this format first occurred. What Ocean allows you to do is, if it's on your board during the standby phase, it lets you bounce a Elemental Hero from your field or your graveyard back to your hand. Or a Destiny Hero, but this deck doesn't play any Destiny Heroes, so it's really just the Elemental Heroes. So that lets you reset a Stratos on the board, right, allowing you to destroy a back row again or search out an Elemental Hero, or more ideally, bounce a Wild Heart or a Stratos. Technically, Ocean can revive Ocean from the graveyard. So as long as you can keep it alive during your standby phase, it allows you to get an instant +1. So a lot of this deck strategy is to generate a ton of card advantage by recurring Elemental Heroes through Ocean, which is partially why we have 2 copies of Snipe Hunter in the deck. We need to be able to turn all of these extra Elemental Heroes, which are normal summons that you might not actually be able to use in one turn, into card advantage. And if you have Ocean on the board with Snipe Hunter, it allows you to every single turn get an extra card to discard off of Snipe Hunter's effect and turn the raw card advantage that this deck can generate into something that you can destroy. The Wild Hearts are useful at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history when you think about the type of decks that you're going to be playing against. Sakuratsu Hammer is really popular. Ring of Destruction is legal. Technically, Torrential Tribute is really popular. That's something both from your perspective and the opponent's perspective, right? You can play Torrential Tribute when you normal summon a Elemental Hero Wild Heart and actually clear the whole field, but since Wild Heart's unaffected by traps, it'll remain on the board. That was a very common play back in the day. Puts a lot of pressure on the opponent, and we just need Elemental Hero names. Honestly, at the end of the day, that's one of the things that this deck wants to do, is just have a lot of Elemental Heroes in the deck to make it so that Stratos always has a target, to make sure that Emergency Call has a target, increase the likelihood that Ocean has a target, right? So even though these cards, specifically Wild Heart, might seem a little underpowered, all things considered, when you think about the other things you could be doing at the time, you really have to look at a card like that in the totality of what this deck is trying to do, which is generate a lot of card advantage, slow the game down, whittle away your opponent's resources, and then If the game's really simplified and you've been using dust shoots to clear your opponent's hand and you leave them with a bunch of dead traps, Wild Heart can deal enough damage to win the game. So it might seem like a weak card, all things considered, but when you look at the totality of what this deck is trying to do, Wild Heart makes a lot of sense. And maybe that will make a little bit more sense with the really large spell lineup. So we have 3 copies of Emergency Call, obviously allowing us to search Stratos, but then allowing us to search Wild Heart and Ocean. I guess I should point out that we also have 2 copies of Reinforcements of the Army. So we'll basically always have Stratos, right? We have pseudo 6 copies of Stratos. This is the maximum quantity of Stratoses / searchers that you could have run at the time. So we're basically always going to see Stratos, which is really important, right? We want to be able to bounce Stratos with Ocean. We want to be able to recur Stratos as much as possible. So having 5 ways of searching it is really important. We, in combination with those Snipe Hunters, want a way of generating card advantage with all of the normal summons that might be clogged in our hands. So we're going to play 3 copies of Lightning Vortex, allowing us to turn those Elemental Hero Ocean ads or Stratos searches into card advantage by destroying your opponent's monsters with either Snipe Hunter or now 3 copies of Lightning Vortex. We have 2 copies of Skyscraper 2 Hero Cities. This is kind of an interesting card. Once per turn during your main phase, you can special summon a Elemental Hero that's been destroyed by battle onto your side of the field. And that card is obviously really powerful. You can only use that once per turn. Well, within its own copy, right? You theoretically could activate another copy if you really needed to, but this card's controller actually has a weird old text that says, only this card's controller can use this effect, and then only once per turn at the beginning there. So it's not sort of the hard once per turn that modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Has. It's a once per turn per copy, so you theoretically could activate another copy if you really wanted to. And I really like, in parentheses at the end, how the original printing has that. Only the user of this card can do that, which is kind of funny. But what it allows you to do is obviously special summon elemental heroes that have been destroyed by battle and make it so that you don't necessarily mind if some of these weaker elemental heroes get destroyed by battle. You can continually recur them through Skyscraper 2. Obviously, once Stratos hits the graveyard, that gives you a ton of access to future elemental heroes or spell and trap destruction, right? If you have an E-hero on the board, your Skyscraper 2 can special summon back Stratos, and now you can destroy an opponent's spell or trap card. Gives you a ton of flexibility there. It makes it really so that the long game is something that's really difficult for your opponent to manage because you have Ocean and Skyscraper 2 continually getting card advantage. And I talked a little bit before about how Lightning, Vortex, and Snipe Hunter can turn dead normal summons, or maybe not dead normal summons, but cards that will otherwise be stuck in your hand into card advantage. Think about the ability to continually revive Stratos, searching either Ocean or Wild Heart, and then maybe Ocean itself getting some card advantage by recurring something during the standby phase. Suddenly you're drawing a card, searching a card, adding a card back every turn. You're getting 2-3 cards per turn, and then that's why the cards like Snipe Hunter and Lightning Vortex are in the deck, so that you can translate those cards into some type of destruction effect. So 2 copies of Skyscraper 2, really cool card. We have 2 Our Righteous Justice. So this card's kind of cool. Basically, it lets you destroy spell and trap cards on the field equal to the quantity of elemental heroes you control. This deck is not going to run, in the main deck at least, either MST or Heavy Storm. So this will do the pseudo spell and trap card destruction that you might typically see in decks. Obviously, this card can go +1, +2 pretty easily if you have a lot of spell and trap. If your opponent has a lot of spell and trap cards, which probably isn't an advisable game plan against a deck with Snipe Hunter and Our Righteous Justice, but maybe they're unfamiliar with the matchup, you can pick off 2 cards really easily. It can be a one-sided Harpy's Feather Duster, right? Especially because cards like Wild Heart are unaffected by trap cards, so your opponent might be sitting there staring at Wild Hearts that they can't deal with. Next thing you know, you play Our Righteous Justice, and now your 2 or 3 trap cards are destroyed, and now your opponent's attacking you for game. This card's pretty cool, has a lot of flexibility in terms of how you use it. It could just be used as a singleton MST. It could be used as a one-sided Harpy's Feather Duster. It really quite a powerful card that's, in combination with everything else that this deck is trying to do to generate card advantage, is sort of up there with one of those tools. And then some singleton one-ups. So this deck actually really benefits from slowing the game down, which is why Swords of Revealing Light is in the deck. Swords of Revealing Light sort of innately is a -1 if nothing happens over those 3 turns, if both players just pass back and forth. But if this allows you to use Ocean's effect, all of a sudden you've already replaced what the Swords of Revealing Light is doing in terms of stalling the game out and costing you a card to do so. If Ocean survives multiple standby phases, next thing you know, your 1 Swords of Revealing Light turned into a draw 2, a draw 3, depending on how many times Ocean gets its effect off. It also could stall the game out so that you can continually use Skyscraper 2. And then some pseudo staples. We have Snatch and Premature. Premature is especially good in this deck with Stratos, obviously. Nobleman Crossout, which was basically a pseudo staple. Not every deck set. Things like Demise didn't necessarily set. Obviously, DDT wouldn't set, but ton of Monarch decks, you're going to want a card like Nobleman. And then Confiscation is really good with this deck's trap lineup. This is one of those decks that, because it's running pseudo stun cards like Wild Heart and cards that if your opponent can't counteract, like Skyscraper 2 and Ocean, because the deck has cards like that, if you can pinpoint the one card that your opponent has that does interact with those and take it from their hand, now all of a sudden your card advantage engines that are going to snowball, like Skyscraper 2 and Ocean, can just take over the game, which is really what this deck is trying to do. Just snowball card advantage through some of those interactions. To support that, we're going to have Triple Solemn Judgment. Triple Solemn Judgment wasn't the level of staple or wasn't nearly as popular as it would be later on in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Obviously, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, Triple Solemn is pretty common in trap decks. This is not a point in time, though, where we saw Triple Solemn all the time. Certainly not. It wasn't really until Teledad where we saw that, maybe even a little bit after. But Triple Solemn Judgment in this deck, we have, this is going to seem interesting, in the main deck, 3 copies of Pulling the Rug, right? Totally different time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Pulling the Rug is a main deckable card, but if you think about it, it really does interact with basically every type of deck. It stops Monarchs, it stops Gadgets, so the Monarch deck, the Gadget deck, and even Gadget Monarch decks are obviously going to be affected by this. It stops all of the Searchers, Sonic Bird, Senju, and Manju out of the Demise OTK, and if you stop them turn 1, you nail one of those Searchers, it can slow them down just enough for you to take advantage. It stops Stratos, so even if your opponent's running T-Hero, you at the bare minimum have the ability to stop a Stratos, which obviously isn't that great, but it is something. If your opponent's otherwise playing the Perfect Circle deck with Monarchs and Stratos in the deck, well, obviously there's a bunch more targets. Theoretically, in the mirror match, you could hit Stratos, so Pulling the Rug has application against basically every single matchup, and as a result, we're going to see 3 copies in the main deck. It's really primarily there to stop Monarchs. At the end of the day, so many decks have Monarchs in them that that's the main reason why we're maining them, but obviously the ability to stop Demise too doesn't hurt. Now we're also going to play 3 copies of Trap Dust Chute. This goes along with the confiscation in the main deck, as I was talking about earlier. You really want to have a sense of what your opponent has. When you have cards like Ocean and Skyscraper 2 that can snowball, you want to make sure you can protect them. I also pinpointed earlier the use of Our Righteous Justice. If you know what your opponent's spell or traps are, you can set it up so that you go +1 or +2 with it, right? Not attack into the Mirror Forest, let it sit there for a little while, make your opponent feel antsy, set another trap card, and now next thing you know, you do Our Righteous Justice for a +1 or 2. Trap Dust Chute's a really important card. It's absolutely phenomenal against the combo decks too, right? We're thinking about a universe where people are running DDT, Demise. Machine decks are starting to come into focus, and then T-Hero's been around for a little bit as well. So the ability to pinpoint, whether it's the Card Trooper that's trying to combine with the Machine Duplication, a Malicious that's trying to combine with Destiny Draw, the ability to pinpoint the combo pieces in your opponent's hand and take them out, obviously phenomenal. We're getting to a point, as the format would progress a little bit past this, where Dust Chute would become borderline staple in any deck that's trying to win, quote-unquote, fairly. Right? The combo decks might not run it, but other decks, a lot of decks, have the triple Trap Dust Chute. To combine with that, we also have 1 copy of Mind Crush, which goes with our confiscation. Then we have some pretty basic Call of the Haunted, Torrential Tribute, and Mirror Force. These are relatively expected trap cards. Call of the Haunted's obviously really good with Stratos. You can go end phase, pop a bunch of back rows, assuming you have a bunch of elemental heroes. You technically can also Call of the Haunted Wild Heart, and the reason why that could be useful is if your opponent plays Heavy Storm, your Wild Heart would stay on the field because it's not affected by Call of the Haunted and the destruction effect that Call of the Haunted would normally have. So it gives you a way of using Call of the Haunted against either MST or Heavy Storm or any spell and trap card destruction to put Wild Heart on the field and have it stay there. So obviously that's really good. Torrential is insane with Wild Heart. As I mentioned earlier, you can summon Wild Heart, play Torrential, clear the field, attack for 15 or maybe 3,000 if you have 2 copies. Mirror Force is basically a pseudo staple. I think Gravity Bind might seem a little bit weird, but your Wild Hearts can actually attack through Gravity Bind. Right? They're unaffected by Gravity Bind's effect. And although your deck's basically all level 4s, the Gravity Bind allows you to ignore that, right? Your Stratos, your Oceans really obviously won't be able to attack. Your Snipe Hunters won't be able to attack. Technically, your Morphing Jar can attack, but your Wild Hearts can attack, and that's the big deal. This deck, as I mentioned earlier, can slow the game down, snowball a bunch of card advantage through Ocean and Hero City 2, and you can just be picking things off with Snipe Hunter and attacking directly with Wild Heart, not worrying about Gravity Bind's effect and winning the game. Gravity Bind's also a fantastic way to guarantee that your Ocean survive till your standby phase. Right? If you have an elemental hero in the graveyard or on the field, you're very much incentivized to have Ocean survive. Well, Gravity Bind does a fantastic job of doing that. So it really does an unbelievable job achieving what this deck is trying to do, which is win the game by grinding your opponent out, ensure that cards like Wild Heart can go through and deal damage, ensure cards like Ocean can generate card advantage, and then eventually snowballing winning the game. So fantastic card for that. This deck doesn't really need a extra deck, so I have just 15 random cards. You do always want to have an extra deck. You don't want to let your opponent know that you're not running something like T-Hero, which uses Metamorphosis. So honestly, you don't really need anything specific, so make sure you have an extra deck so that your opponent can't assume the matchup. Same thing with true with something like Demise. Demise needs fusion cards where they're Metamorphosis. You don't want your opponent to know ahead of time that you're not running Demise, T-Hero, any of those types of decks. So make sure you have an extra deck. Before we get into the side deck, let's talk about some of the top decks of the time. There was certainly variations of Gadgets. There were certainly variations of Monarch decks. We still have Good Stuff decks. We have just a ton of Monarch decks. Yeah, I already commented on Monarch. So we have Apprentice Monarchs, Koichi Monarchs, just tons and tons of Monarch decks. We have DDT. We have Demise of Decay. We have Machine Beatdown. We have T-Hero, which I'll represent with Metamorphosis and Destiny Draw. We have Perfect Circle, which I'll represent with Disc Commander and Thastalos. Card Trooper, I guess I'll put here. A lot of decks had Card Trooper in it. Chain Burn, and then I hadn't really previously been talking about it, but I guess technically Six Samurais existed, though they weren't very good. The Mirror Match is very uncommon. Very unlikely that you'd run the Mirror Match or run into the Mirror Match, but I will put that there. How are we counteracting this? Well, this extra deck, rather side deck, it's basically just Jeff's side deck. This was Jeff's main deck almost card for card. Oh, it is his main deck card for card. It's his side deck all but one card. I didn't really like one of the card choices, so I switched it. So he had 3 copies of Exile Force, which is really good against Monarchs, particularly Monarch decks that are trying to set things like Spy. Spy could be a big problem for this deck. That 2000 defense is really annoying. Exile Force is useful because you have double Rhoda, so you essentially have 5 ways of getting into this. Triple Cyber Dragon, it's a good way of attacking over Spies. Technically pretty good in the Mirror Match, too. We had Neospatian Grandma, which is another way of counteracting some of the set card that the slower decks like Apprentice Monarchs or Spy-based Monarch decks would do. We had Triple Smash and Ground. Now, if your opponent's running a Good Stuff deck, it's pretty good to pick off some cards with Smash and Ground. It's a generic removal. We have some small trap removal if the Our Righteous Justices are not enough. We have MST and Heavy Storm. We have 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole. And the card that I switched out, so Jeff had a 3rd copy of Skyscraper 2, and I didn't feel like that was a great choice. I don't know why I'd want to side in a 3rd copy. So I put a DD Designator. I looked through some side decks, and I tried to find cards that I have yet to profile during this format. Matt Lawrence ran a pair of DD Designators, actually, in his side deck. DD Designator would have been used against the combo decks, and I figured with Triple Dust Shoot and Mind Crush plus Confiscation, it's a reasonable chance that you know it's in your opponent's hand, especially if they're running Demise or a deck that would be searching combo pieces. So I figured DD Designator would make a little bit of sense there because it goes along with what this deck is trying to do. Rid your opponent of those combo pieces, make it so that your must kills like Ocean and Skyscraper 2 stay on the field and generate card advantage that eventually grinds your opponent out. So I like to put a 15th card DD Designator because it's a card we've yet to profile that I think might actually fit a role in this particular strategy. But regardless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.